People don't realize whether you're self-published or traditionally published, even if you're a New York bestseller, you don't have like volumes of resources at your command to get out there and market the way that you would love. Not the back in the day they used to, but they don't do that anymore. There's too many, right? When there's 4,000 books published every day, brand new, not repeats, every day, and your book gets published in there, you're like, how does my trout look different than all the other trout in the river, right? So we're gonna find how to do shelter, food, ammo. I love to call it that, and the different types of gorillas that are out there in the wilderness, because you can pair with them and you can grow and become better and bigger guerrilla fighters. So the first rule to understand is perception is reality, right? If there's one thing I've learned in this community, if you're perceived a certain way, it is reality for those people. I can't tell you how many times I've been to events and people have come up to me like, hey, you're so awesome, I want you to sign this book, which is great. I love that they do that, right? But then like, I'm like two steps down from like a New York bestseller. I'm like, what about his book? And they're like, who is he? I'm like, I love that you said that. That makes me feel wonderful, but why did you come to me instead of, I'm like, I try to pick their brains. I'm like, well, I saw you on these programs. I saw you go to these places. I saw you at all these events. You're the guy. I'm like, I love you once more. Perception is reality. How people perceive you, how the community perceives you, it's a reality. That's how you are. Now, anybody who follows me on Instagram, and you should follow me on Instagram, you can look through the past 6 months. That's when I really went incredibly crazy on Instagram. You'll see, like, it looks like I'm everywhere, They're like, wow, he's up at Sundance. Yeah, wow, he's down in Provo. He's in St. George. How's he everywhere? Well, one of my 4 jobs is driving Lyft. So, like, yeah, you kind of go a lot of places when you drive people around. And if you take pictures when you're there, people just go, wow, this guy's everywhere. I got to follow. What's he doing next? I got to see that, right? That's a percent. I mean, I'm not hiding it from him. I put Lyft, right? Like, I drive Lyft, but it doesn't matter. It's the perception that they start to build in their minds. Now, I also go to a lot of conferences and other pieces, but where you go places, the more you put yourself out there, which is incredibly uncomfortable. Now, at first, it's super uncomfortable for yourself. It becomes less uncomfortable for you and more uncomfortable for people in your surroundings. So, like, when I take pictures, like, I'm at a work event, and we'll go to, like, Top Golf. I love Top Golf. And I'll, like, take pictures. I'm like, hey, look at us playing Top Golf. My coworkers are like, oh, my gosh. They all know. My wife's going to know that I went playing Top Golf and what I ate for lunch before, the bosses back at the office do. That's true. It does become a little uncomfortable. And there's obviously a place where you've got to be where it's comfortable for you when it comes to taking pictures and posting things. But the more you put yourself out there in general, as a rule, as we go through this, you'll see, that's what's going to increase perception and give you access to resources you never thought you could have access to. Okay, what are guerrilla fighters like, right? When you think of a guerrilla fighter, you don't think of like soft, cuddly, wonderful, just down-to-earth people. Well, they might be down-to-earth, but they're always tough. They're hardworking. If you want to be a successful author, it's one of the hardest things you can do. Like, driving Lyft is super easy, right? Like, if I wanted easy jobs, like, I can just drive Lyft. I work security for Real Salt Lake. That's easy. Dealing with the drunk, angry people, that's easy compared to, like, surviving in the writing community, right? My IT job where they love me, like, I could always just be the introvert and just hang out there and do okay for myself. But it's about being tough, hardworking, and they're cautious all at the same time. When I say cautious, like, guerrilla fighters don't, like, do stuff that would get all of them killed right off the bat, right? They don't just run out there and willy-nilly and do whatever and flail about. They'll just get caught and captured and killed. Now, thankfully, we don't get killed in the writing community. Not often. But as we start to go through this, you'll see that if you really want to survive in the writing community, you could either write a book that instantly becomes a New York bestseller, gets it sold into a movie, or you could be like all the rest of the 4,000 of us that published every day. It's a lot of hard work. So everybody becomes a guerrilla because they believe in a cause. We believe in our cause. A little bit more of the 10%. So the top 10% get 90% of the money in the writing industry. That's New York Times published that piece. So we just want a little bit. That's our cause. We just want like a little bit of that 90%. Make a difference, correct an imbalance. Anybody feels like they could be successful in the writing community, they always do a few things. They'll Google it. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've Googled how to become a New York bestseller. There's articles on it. I don't believe them. I'm still not. I followed the pattern, right? You know somebody who is a New York bestseller, somebody who's won awards, like they'll help you, like they'll help guide and give you suggestions, right? And you volunteer, you kind of just jump into things to kind of figure out how to grow. Now, the tools and resources for guerrilla marketing in the community is first Shelter, which are organizations that have roots, that have connections. That means against our natural introvert behaviors, we need to go join writing groups. And I don't just mean like the local critique group with the friends in the neighborhood. Those are good. Those are great. Actually, they're a little bit down on the list under food. The groups that will sustain you and keep you alive. But writing organizations like, coming to LTUE to meet friends and connect with people, that's huge. Actually connecting with people is bigger than just attending the conference. If you were to come to LTUE and not attend a single class, but make a series of friends, it is more than worth it, because this is like a gold mine for that kind of resource. Joining groups like the League of Utah Writers, going to other conferences like Storymakers or some of the local conferences around, the Wasatch Writers Fellowship. There's lots of groups out there. Join as many as you can around there. Why? Because you're all in the same struggle. You're all in the same struggle. I love to put it under Shelter because as you're struggling, it's a place you can go back to, and they all understand. They all get it. They feel your pain. You've just been rejected. You've just got a hard review on your book. Agents, nobody's picking you up. They all get it, right? And you need more than just a spouse or a couple of good friends. Having a community of people to go back to and say, oh, it's tough out there. But it's also important because if you succeed and you go back to them and say, look, I made it, I don't know how, but they picked me up, right? Then it's a win for everybody, and it lifts everybody up at the same time. So as you go back with your struggles, you'll see people winning, and they'll want to help you too. Everybody lifts together. So join the writing communities, right? Civic groups with connections. How I started getting involved in the community was joining the West Jordan Arts Council. They were desperate need of somebody to do literary work. And the person before me had only run like an annual writing contest. I'm like, does it have a budget? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, well, then I'm going to do more than run contests. As I got involved with them, suddenly I was able to connect resources. That group, being on the West Jordan Arts Council, I could do things as powerful as reserve the Viridian for free, the event center out in West Jordan, which, if anybody's been there, it's a gorgeous facility. If you haven't been there, it's a nice, very generous facility, which normally would cost anywhere between $5,000 and $12,000 to rent. And I had the power to do that for free, being on the Arts Council. Now, every group, any writing group who wants to hold a conference, that's the number one logistical problem. Finding a facility, right? Because it costs a lot of money. I was a part of the West Jordan Arts Council. I had just barely volunteered for the League of Utah Writers at the time, who wanted to hold a book signing contest or a book signing workshop for people. And they didn't have money, and West Jordan didn't have the logistics to put on anything like that. But I was able to connect the two pieces together. All of a sudden I was like, hey, why aren't you guys talking to each other? They're like, we didn't know we could. We didn't know each other existed. And we put on this thing called the Spring into Books, which had gotten 12,000 or 1,200, not 12,000, 1,200 people showed up to our first event that we had logistically planned for like 200 people to show up to. So suddenly we gave resources to authors, resources to a city, right? So civic groups are just as important as joining writing groups if you participate in art councils. But on top of all of that, what ended up happening is I just connected the two pieces, right? I was like the guy who was like, hey, you two should talk because I know what you guys are both capable of. Like that was like my main piece of it. I did some minor planning for it, but because I said that, like everybody was just wanting to like say, Jared did all this amazing stuff. And I'm like, no, it wasn't me. It was all of them. They did all the work. But it didn't matter. At that point, suddenly people thought I was far more important than I really was. Suddenly they're like, ooh, this guy, he's figured it out. He was able to do something that like we couldn't figure out in the last 10 years. And he did it for free, and we made money out of it, and everybody was happy. Like, how did this happen? We ended up on TV. We got on like Channel 2. Like, even I didn't know how that magic happened. But it's because I joined a civic group, I joined a local writing group, and all I did was there participating. And I was able to find these resources and plug them together. They'll also be there to support you. Food, the platforms that will sustain you, which is the community, which is the really close friends, the friends who will give you the really nice critiques, the family that will give you the always nice critiques also, but like the groups of people that read your stuff a lot before it makes it, because when it gets published, they'll be the first ones who buy your book. Those will be the first ones who tell their best friends about it and will brag about you. Right? Those people are near and dear to your heart and will do everything in their power to make sure you succeed. So it's important as you go along this path to try and make close personal friendships, and not just see people as resources, which is, some people do. Ammo. When it comes to guerrilla marketing, ammo is connections, right? Just as important as I was a connection for the Arts Council and for West Jordan, or for the League of Utah Writers to create the event, making a connection. If you become best friends with, say, the senior editor of a publisher, if you become good friends with a conference organizer, those are people who suddenly, like, you can ask them a direct question. Hey, do you think this book's good enough to get onto this? And they'll say, yeah, you should submit this. And you've got an inside person, like, rooting for you, right? So connections are vital and important. The more connections that you make, networking, once again, getting outside the introvert sphere, which is really tough. Get out and talk to everybody you can, because you have no idea. Like, I was sitting out on the table out there, and I watched, I'm sure everybody knows Lisa Mingham, but like Lisa Mingham was sitting there, and then there was a couple other editors just sitting there like big time, and then there was somebody sitting to my right, and they're like, oh, I wish I could meet like somebody important at this conference, maybe an editor, somebody who's important. Like, I'm like, like you're sitting like right next to like all of them. I really wanted to say that, but at the same time, I didn't want Lisa to hear me say, you all talk to just Lisa. Here's her email address. No. No, those connections are important. The passionate people that they'll trust, you trust them. But it's funny, this last piece of ammo, which is called information. I am, like I said, on so many nonprofits, right? I'm on Storymakers Board. I'm on the League of Utah Writers presidency, right? Like, I'm over like these big regional organizations, and I still have no idea all the writing conferences that happen in Utah every day, like every week. Every week there's literally a writing conference someplace. I swear it. It might be by a high school, it might be by a library, it could be by a small writing group. They're all over the place. Well, I'm over all these groups and I have no idea all of them. But I try to attend or go to or support as many as I can, because those groups, it's like grassroots. Once you're in with those groups, Like they'll celebrate you to death. Like they will build memorials for you if you support them and help them out. They'll do everything they can to make sure you succeed. Okay, so the different types of guerrillas, right? What it means is, my last League of Utah Writers Conference, I had the opportunity to drive multiple New York best-selling author, Tim Dorsey, and he's an international best-selling author. It's funny, not a lot of people in Utah know him, but he's really famous back east. Anyhow, I was asked, as I'm driving him from the airport, we're talking, and I said, yeah. He goes, I had to schedule my last book tour, to get through, because I just needed a couple extra bucks. I'm like, and I turned to him, I'm like, you mean by scheduled book tour, you mean like you told somebody schedule me a book tour, right? He goes, no. I'm like, what do you mean no? I'm like, you're published through not random. He's through a big publisher. But I asked him, I'm like, you just told somebody to do it and they booked it for you, right? And he goes, no. He goes, I would love that. If you could plug me into that. I'm like, you're a multiple New York best-selling author. He goes, yeah, I am. Okay. That really kind of put some things into perspective for me. No, he goes, no, don't get me wrong. When he calls like a Barnes & Nobles or someplace, when he calls them and says, hey, this is Tim Dorsey, I'd like to come do a book signing and, make these arrangements, or, can you get a group to sponsor me? Like, they're like, yes, multiple New York best-selling author. Absolutely, we want you. Now, as me, like if I called someplace and said, hey, this is Jared Quan, I'd like to do a book signing, they'll go, who? It's right out of some of the movies, right? Like, they're like, who are you? If you're a New York award-winning author, then you will have access to extra resources right off the bat. Conferences, doors will be open for you. It's not guaranteed. You still have to do work, right? If you get a movie made about your book, if you know a politician prominent, you're best friends with an organizer, all of these things kind of like get you access to other levels, right? You suddenly now have access to a lot more doors that you can go through super easy. Now, for us, like I always recommend volunteering. Now I always put other because there's always something I don't think of, but there's another. But volunteering is the one I always do for the strongest guerrilla marketing. When you start to build your resources, as you're going to start to want to have influence over the community, that's what happened. 4 years ago, when nobody knew who I was, I just started by volunteering, right? And I'd never made a commitment. I didn't say I'm going to lead, two of the most powerful writing organizations in Utah. Like that wasn't on an agenda for me. Like that's not even my goal. I'd prefer not to, if possible. But volunteering is, first of all, low cost. If anybody who's attended conferences, whether it's FanX or LTUE or any of those others, you can go to these conferences for free if you volunteer, right? Like, so the last 3 years, I haven't paid to go to a single conference. My wife did the math on that one time, and it was lots. It's thousands of dollars that I didn't have to spend to pay to go to the conference, right? I was able to volunteer into the conference. Now, there's a few other aspects of this, which it's good to know. Like, you get to go at your own comfort level. Some people can volunteer a lot of time. If you have younger kids, it's obviously going to be much tougher than if your kids are older. Like my kids, my 5 kids, 3 of them are teenagers. It makes it much easier on me to be able to dedicate more of my time. But you can flex it to wherever you have the ability to volunteer. You can evolve into any other kind of guerrilla. And what that means is, like, so the very first year I volunteered for FanX, like I became best friends with the guy over the panel organization stuff. And I just asked him one time, I'm like, hey, so how do you get on a panel at FanX? He's like, shoot me an email. And he gave it to me. And I'm like, I've been on panels on FanX ever since, right? When you, now I know I'm friends with a conference organizer. Now, of course, at this point, being on the boards for these other groups, I'm also, of course, friends with the organizer because sometimes I'm the organizer. But you can evolve in the other groups. Suddenly people know who you are. Like, it shocked me the other day when, like, Dan Wells came over to me at a conference we were at, and he goes, "Hey, Jared, good to see you." I'm like, "You know my name." Yes. I'm happy you know my name. He goes, "Yeah, of course I know your name." I'm like, "Yeah, of course. Everybody knows my name," right? It's suddenly I know somebody who's a little bit more important in the community. Suddenly you know you have access to more resources, and you're able to accomplish more things, and still not spend any money, right? I haven't spent money. I haven't put out Facebook ads targeted at Dan Wells to know who I am. Though I think that would be amusing. It's easy to build resources when you're volunteering. Now, I always put this how to be a guerrilla, because for people they think volunteering is kind of easy. Like, you volunteer, you do your job, you show up. There's pieces to it, because there's a lot of volunteers over the years that as I volunteered. There's a lot of volunteers who are clearly in it for themselves, and they're very self-serving, and all they do is talk about themselves, and like they are actually like pretty useless when it comes to volunteer, and I don't trust them. I don't want to give them important tasks. I don't want them back at my conference. It's important. There's a couple things I always recommend. I say be a guerrilla for the people, and that just means when you're volunteering, don't ever talk about yourself. Don't talk about your books unless, I always put this caveat, somebody asks you. If somebody's like, "Oh, what do you do? What do you write?" Then yeah, you could tell them, "Hey, yeah, I'm a writer. I've written some stuff." So there was a conference. Does anybody know what the Forever Young Foundation is? It's run by Steve Young, the former quarterback of the 49ers. So he has this foundation to help kids, and I love Steve Young. I had written for Sports Illustrated at one point and for the 49ers, and so I have an idol at home. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll see the big picture in my office of Steve Young's jersey. But so I got to volunteer for one of his conferences. And I showed up there, and I thought, okay, first of all, I had to tell myself 1,000 times, don't geek out. Like, don't freak out. Last thing I want to do is get kicked out of this event. But, I found out from the volunteer coordinator that half the volunteers didn't show up that had committed. So they were understaffed. And she told us that. I'm like, "Hey, wherever you need me, I'm more than happy to keep volunteering." She goes, "No, it's not fair. You only had to commit to half a day. You could still go to the rest of the conference." I'm like, no, I get it. As a conference person, I get how important it is. I'm going to help. And so I did. I ran around, just did all sorts of things for them. And at the end, they were going to have this big gala dinner. And I was like moving these signs. So I'm trapped in an elevator with these big signs. This guy walks in and goes, "Hey, I've kind of seen you everywhere." I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, I think I should know who you are. I'm like, "No, I'm nobody. I'm a peon. I'm just me, a volunteer." And he's like, "Yeah, well," he goes, "It's good to meet you." I told him my name is Jared, and he's like, "That's awesome." So then I rode up the elevator, put the signs up upstairs, and the gala finished, and it went really well. After the gala, the volunteer coordinator came over, and she's like, "You've got to meet the director of the Steve Young Foundation." And that was the guy I was in the elevator with. And he goes, "I am super impressed with you." Now, it also helped that I was wearing a suit. I wear a suit to everything. I don't recommend everybody wear a suit. They're hot. Anyhow, he says to me, "I'm super impressed with you. And for our next event, I really want to have you more involved." And I'm like, oh. I'm like, "Yes, please." So then I got invited to help out with the Steve Young golf tournament, and they had like all sorts of NFL superstars there, and which that was tough for me not to geek out then, seeing all these like NFL legends coming to play golf, and like there's Steve, and he's walking back and forth. Like, I became really good friends with Steve Young's parents and his sister, who are super involved with running the events. But like, I'm like, okay, don't geek out every time Steve comes by. Steve's like, "Hey, good to see you. Thank you for volunteering." I'm like, yeah. Shook his hand. Steve Young shook my hand. He threw a lot of touchdowns with that hand. So when you're volunteering, make it not about you. It's not about you, not yet. There will be a point where it is about you, obviously, but it's got to not start about you. And I always recommend you set yourself apart. Be willing to do extra tasks, even if not necessarily asked. Arrive early, stay late, volunteer for the extra projects. Be overly polite, even when people are not. And it can be, like, people can be very not understanding if they paid money to come to something and you're a volunteer and you have no control. So they could blow up at you. I've had people blow up at me at conferences. Like, okay, I'll just thank you so much. I'll do what I can. Help you out. And people notice that. The staff notices that. Everybody around you notices those pieces. Dress nice. Like I said, don't wear a suit. Partially because that's my thing, right? So if everybody wore a suit, then they'd go, oh, I thought that was Jared. That's not Jared. No, dress nice, but pick something that sets you apart. There's one fantastic woman who published her book, and at her book launch, she did everything sunflowers. So she wears a sunflower hat everywhere she goes. And she's been to like 3 or 4 writing conferences now. And she goes, it works. I'm like, yes, it's called branding, right? Like authors know this. That's like a basic piece to it. But she goes, I'll wear that hat in the public. Like she was at a jazz game and 3 people came up to her and said, hey, I loved your book. It's fantastic. And she's like, nobody's ever done that. She goes, that was my 3rd book. That was the first time that anybody's ever done that. I'm like, well, maybe they were a huge fan, but she goes, no, it's the hat. Okay. So I promised her I'd tell people not to wear a sunflower hat. So that's off the table. But pick something that sets you apart, something that is unique and characteristic for you. Volunteer often. Remember, the bigger the role you take, the more you take on, the faster your resources grow when it comes to volunteering. The more that you're going to be able to draw from when it comes to actually putting on your marketing campaign, right? The first day I was in the League of Utah Writers meeting, like I was sitting in the back of the room, and I'm that guy who doesn't volunteer for anything. And their president had stepped down from the chapter, and the vice president was taking over. She goes, I need somebody to be vice president. I'm like, not going to do it. I'm like, there's 30 people in the room. I'm not going to volunteer to be. Nobody knows me. So I was texting my wife. I'm like, so they have this thing, and they need a person. I'm like, just tell me no because, I'm already committed to stuff. She texts back. She goes, that sounds fantastic. You need to say yes. I'm like, fine. Right, so I sent her an email with attached my LinkedIn address. And after the meeting was over, she runs up to me. She goes, you're our new vice president. I'm like, don't you need to vote or something? She goes, look, some people texted me and said, hey, if nobody else. She goes, but nobody sent me a resume. I'm like, my bad. But that's what gave me a lot of influence over our first events. That gave me a plug-in with a lot of initial authors. The new chapter president was best friends with a bunch of local authors who were bestsellers who had no idea who I was. I mean, I knew who they were. I'd seen them around. But suddenly I was able to become friends with them on Facebook. I got to meet them a lot at events. Suddenly it was just a thing. It was normal. It was bizarre. But so the higher the role you take on, the more you're going to be able to draw from. We're getting to the really juicy stuff in just a minute. So keep score. The one thing that guerrilla fighters love to see is when the newspaper runs guerrillas strike again. Nothing makes the government more angry than the guerrillas took us down over here. But since there's no newspaper that covers writers, Jared volunteers at conference again. Since that's not a thing, which would be pretty awesome if somebody could get on that now. So you have to keep score for yourself. Now, some people say they use Facebook for their keeping score, which is tough, right? Because if you did an event 6 months ago and somebody's trying to look at you now, nobody's going to sit there and want to scroll through 6 months of posts to find what you've been doing. LinkedIn's super easy and straightforward because it literally is a resume, right? It puts it up there. Now, people will say, look, authors aren't going to sell books being on LinkedIn. That's not true, but you won't sell many books just posting your stuff on LinkedIn. But all of the conference organizers who want to know who you are and what you do, they Google you, right? And of course, they'll look at your Facebook, but LinkedIn is high on the list. They'll look through they'll go, oh, this person's taught at 6 conferences in the last 2 years. That's important to know. But if they're trying to scan through your Facebook group, looking to see what events you did the last 2 years, they're going to lose interest fast. Conference organizers, publishers, lots of people will look at your LinkedIn page. And it's nice to have it already presented for them, because you get to decide how it's presented. What comes first, what's most important to you. So keep score for yourself. Even if it's minor, I volunteered at this event. I taught at this event. I was involved with this event. Those things all are important, because the bigger the conference you want to volunteer for, the bigger the role you want to be in. They're going to say, what are your credentials? Why should we? Because if we don't know you really well, you say, well, check out my LinkedIn. Look at all the stuff I've done. I know what I'm doing. Or I'm faking it really well. Okay. So now we're going to now that you've done the volunteer work, you've done a lot of legwork, you've worked really hard in the community, right? People kind of know who you are. They're kind of aware of what you can do. We're going to prime a marketing campaign. You're going to put all your resources here. You're going to put yourself out there on a level that you've never been before. And that's terrifying. That's the most terrifying thing I'll ever tell anybody to do, is to put yourself out there. The first time somebody says to you, hey, we're going to have you present at this conference, and you've never presented before, that is terrifying, right? If you stand up in front of a group of people, the last thing you think, oh crap, I'm going to screw up. I'm going to be really nervous. People are going to hate me. And then everything goes down like flames. You watch the whole thing. So you do. When you're ready to go, when you're ready to actually execute on your marketing campaign, you make a change. You do something audacious. Because that signals to everybody you know that something different is happening. Family members notice this closer, typically like parents do. I can't tell you how many times I'll post something and my mom will call me, hey, what's going on? What's happening? If my mom can notice from my Facebook post, everybody else kind of sees it. But you're going to do it on a couple different levels. Put yourself out there. That might mean teaching. That might mean leading. That might mean organizing something. It's going to be scary, but it's going to be worth it. Go outside your bubble. Talk to everybody. Don't be the person sitting 2 feet away from the managing editor of something, hoping that you could someday talk to a managing editor. It's okay to stop and say hi to people at any conference. Shake their hands. It kind of actually shocks people, but everybody's friendly. Right? Nobody's been angry with me when I'm like, hey, how you doing? I love people's names in particular because I like to try and steal them for my books. That's a fantastic name. Be willing to talk to people. But at the same time, I like this. Keep a low profile. You're like, yeah, right. Yeah, right. That's contradictory. No, that just means you're still not bragging about what's coming. Right? It isn't about you yet. Do everything you can for everybody you can, but don't burn yourself out. Right? You got to be realistic with yourself and your family and your expectations. And don't ask for anything yet, if you can avoid it. Sometimes you do. You need to ask for help on things. Okay, now we're going to unleash the whole campaign. You're going to utilize all of the resources that you've built. You're going to call the panel organizer for Comic-Con. You're going to call the conference organizers for LTUE or Storymakers or the League and say, what can I do? I've got this coming up. This book launch is happening. All right, this is going to be a thing for me, and I would love to know what I can do to help you and what you can do to help me. And because you've done so much in the community, they all want to bend over backwards for you. Be everywhere you have access to. Okay, so after you've actually done the book launch, then you're going to start it all over again. You're like, oh, that's kind of anticlimactic. Got to start all over again. Well, not really. You don't lose all the contacts. But this is one of my favorite parts of the whole thing. So as a kid, some people did, and I'm not saying I was one of them, some people put together a cute little journal of what their dream wedding would be. What clothes, where it was going to be, what the flowers were going to be.
You didn't do that?
Not publicly admitting it. Not denying it. But this is actually something that you should do for yourself for your book launch. Where would I want my book launch to be? Where's my dream book launch? Who would I want at my dream book launch? How many people would I want there? What do I want it to look like? These are all aspects that people don't pre-plan ahead of time, especially if they're like banking on their traditional publisher to do it for them. Some traditional publishers do it a little bit better than others, but most of the time they're like, hey, do you have any ideas? And you're like, well, I have ideas. I thought you had like a team of people on this. And they're like, no, that they got let go in the 80s. Right? You need to put together what your ideal book launch will be. You need to figure it out. Because there's some things that you, like some research you need to do ahead of time. For instance, you can't choose a public library most of the time. There's like one library that's an exception. Because public libraries, especially in Salt Lake County, Utah County, won't let you sell anything on their property. So having a book launch there doesn't make sense. Now there's the one Provo library that does, but you have to be like a higher profile author to book that. But if you don't know that ahead of time, then you don't know, right? So if you want to hold it at King's English, okay, well, who do I need to become friends with at King's English? You can't just like call them up one day, King's English, we're going to have a book launch there. They'll go, oh, are you? So you need to plan it out. You need to plot what you would like to see. Now, some of the things that people never think about is like press coverage at your book launch. If you're traditionally published, your publisher will most likely send out press statements. If you're hybrid published, most likely they didn't. If you're self-published, nobody definitely did it for you, right? You got to do that yourself. Press releases, like you suddenly have to look that up. Okay, how often? How long? How far out do I have to do that? If I want to have like a newspaper there, it's possible. It's not impossible. But in order to get that piece of resource to your book launch event, you have to make the effort. You have to become friends with, you have to reach out to, you have to work with somebody that will help you put in contact with those people well before a book launch. So oftentimes I tell people to start this process, especially if they're not published yet, because this is something that you start doing long before you're actually published. Because when you come to hit that book launch, you want it with everything you got. You want everybody to show up. Now, your dream event might be FanX. Hey, I'm going to have my book launch at FanX, and that might cost you $5,000 or free. I've had friends launch books there for free. I've had a friend who launched a book there, paid $5,000. So, I mean, you could choose if you're independently wealthy. You can definitely pay more money to get all of the things on your dream list. Or you could go through this process and build those resources up so that when it's time for you to do it, you have all the resources. And guess what? You literally paid hardly anything for those resources. All these people know who you are, right? Dan Wells knows who I am. I don't know that he would show up at my book launch. Maybe. If I target some Facebook ads. But the key is to start doing that now. Start planning out what you want your book launch to be and what resources you're going to need, right? If you want to have your book launch at LTUE, what do you need to do? It gives you very specific goals that suddenly are clear to you. That's not like something that's inherent to authors.
Do you do digital marketing with your book launches? Do you plan, say, have an email list, newsletter, a launch sequence, getting ready where you warm up your list and you prep it, then you launch, open cart, close cart?
Yeah, it's like all connected. Yes, you have to do everything that you can. Now what I love, if you worked really hard with volunteers, like I've been fortunate to be like good friends with a lot of digital marketing people who I'm like, hey, how do I do this better? What's the best tool to do this? And they're like, psh, here you go. You know what? You want me to help you with that? Let me just hit enter for you. I'm like, thank you. Thank you so much. When you volunteered and got these resources, there's a lot of people in the community that will do everything they can to help you. And suddenly you'll find yourself having access to a lot of digital marketing people that'll help you save time and effort and energy. Now, of course, you go back through it, join the organizations, get out there, join the writing groups, start volunteering. Now, people ask me some interesting questions. So there was a writing conference not too long ago that I signed up to volunteer for. I just went on I wasn't invited to speak or anything. I'm just like, yeah, I'd love to volunteer. They reached out to me and said, why would you want to volunteer for us? Because they're like, you're over the league, you're on Storymakers board, you do all this stuff. I'm like, because you need help. If you need volunteers, I'm more than happy to volunteer. I want to see everybody succeed because their goal is ultimately the same goal as my goal, same goal as everybody else's goal. And that is everybody wants to give everybody the resources they need to succeed, right? And if I have knowledge or ability that could help them do that better, I'm going to do that. That's just my personality. I don't think everybody has to do that. But when you go through that effort, people will just do amazing things for you. And they'll say amazing things. I can't tell how many times that now I've been invited to boards. Like I've been called for arts councils in different cities throughout the state. Like, hey, could you volunteer on our board? And I'm like, no, but I'd love to. I really would. 5, 6 is my max. I found that out. Now everybody has a different number. You shouldn't aim to be 6 and then kill yourself. However, there's a different secret to being able to manage 6 nonprofit boards and work 4 jobs. That's a different class altogether. Now, of course, if you ever have any questions, if you need help with anything, feel free to reach out to me. I'm a pretty nice guy. I want to see that you succeed. It's funny, the Instagram actually changed because the digital marketing person said 164 after the end of your name indicates a bot. So I changed it. It's Jared A. Quan, so you can just look me up at Jared Quan on Instagram. So there's a little tip for you if you didn't know that already. Don't put numbers after your name if you're Instagramming or Twittering. But yeah, feel free to reach out to me anytime with any question. You could hit me on Facebook. You can email me. I answer. I'm pretty quick to answer. I want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to succeed. Now, does anybody have any questions?
What's the best way to start becoming aware of all the events in your area?
Yes. I'm still working on that answer. Now, somebody told me that they were going to put together a website that would do such a thing. Now, this mythical creature, I'll call it the magic unicorn, doesn't exist. I have worked super hard. But if you can Google, you can go on Facebook groups, you can find them, right? You could definitely do a lot of manual work to find them. But the more involved you are in groups and writing groups, the more you'll just learn about them. You'll hear about them ahead of time. Any other questions?
You juggle a lot. Are you able to sleep 8 hours a night, or is that?
That's the trick. If you give up sleep, you can accomplish anything.
Or nothing.
When it comes to actual time management, that's been the trick of things. I do everything with the support and communication with my wife. I'm very fortunate. She helps me and guides me through everything. Before I plan anything for the month, I always sit down with her and we plan out what family things are happening for the month. So it might be, we're doing this on this Saturday, kids got parent-teacher conferences, we're doing these different things. And then I'll schedule all the other groups around that. They'll say, hey, are you available this day? Nope, parent-teacher conferences. Everybody understands that, It's universal language. So then you schedule around it. First thing you do is you take care of yourself and your family. If it means going to a family reunion, going to a family dinner, taking care of your kids, that always comes first and foremost. But the more organizations you're involved in, the more access to resources that helps you shortcut things like digital marketing. I do grant writing for an organization, and I actually ask the grant writer on different groups, what's the best practice to grant write for this group? And they give me the tips and tricks. And now I don't have to do hundreds of hours of research. I'm like, okay, these are the 6 grants I'm after because most likely we're going to get those. So yes, you can spread yourself too thin. Don't do that. Communicate with your spouse, significant other, or best friends. Come up with a plan. Work it out. That's the most important piece. Awesome. Well, I think that's it. I appreciate you coming out to the panel.